Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 3 and 12b through 32. Hear the word of the Lord. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus, and the Pharisees and scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? And yet here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he sent off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and went to him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' The father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder brother was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never even given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' And the father said to him, 'Son, you were always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. We started discussing God's will last week in terms of applying God's priorities to our lives, our choices, our decisions, our actions. How we engage others is inextricably linked to following after God's will in our lives. If we would love God, it's obvious from so many texts that we must love everyone around us. All too often, however, it is the very people around us we seem to have the most trouble treating with dignity, respect, and grace. How can we possibly follow God's direction without treating one another properly, without valuing one another's full humanity, without honoring one another after the ways God has treated us? Grace does not seem to be a particularly easy concept for us to embrace and apply to ourselves or to others, for that matter. We seem to have some deep-seated desire to relegate grace to a lesser position in our lives than God would desire. In today's passage, the more visibly religious people were grumbling about the relationships Jesus was building with people who did not measure up. Tax collectors, who worked on behalf of the hated Romans, who often extorted their own kinsmen for personal profit, were among those who could be readily found in Jesus' retinue. Others, readily deemed as sinners, were also part of Jesus' retinue. The more visibly religious folks were not so much against Jesus' teaching as they were concerned that Jesus was relaxing condemnation and judgment in favor of grace. After all, Jesus was giving these people of no account as much or more attention and care than they were receiving. How dare Jesus be a religious leader, a prophet, and then consort with all manner of unworthy folk, when he should be spending his time and energy propping up, comforting, and encouraging those who had devoted their lives to seeking after God. They weren't so much against Jesus as wanting him all to themselves, to others like them. They figured they should have more direct access. They had paid their dues. They had put in the time. They had earned a greater degree of God's attention. And Jesus was wasting himself on folks who were of no account, on folks who did not deserve his attention, on folks who were beneath him, beneath them. In the context of this general complaint, Jesus offered this parable we commonly refer to as the prodigal son. A father's belongings could be divided up among his sons before or after his death according to a rather strict formula. A father could determine it was time to concede control of his assets and divide them up early. For a son to determine it was time to concede control of the assets, that was an act of disassociation on part of the son. It was a direct violation of the requirement to honor one's parents. The father was being disowned by a son making such a request. It was only natural that the rest of the family should take umbrage at such an egregious action. It was a severing of ties, an affront, an end to the familial belonging from which there could be no return. You are dead to me. Give me what is mine. You are no longer my father. I am no longer your son. Strict adherence to the Mosaic Code would call for such a son to be put to death. We are perhaps more accustomed to hearing stories of parents turning out children who didn't measure up, of spouses divorcing, of congregations splitting, of siblings becoming estranged, or friends parting ways. We often find those difficult things to process. But in the cultural context, it was perhaps harder to accept a son divorcing himself from family, as this was a very patriarchal culture. The affront could not be much harsher. In this context, Jesus chooses for addressing grace. He begins with a father who not only offers grace at the end of the story, but from the very beginning. The father who had been declared dead by his youngest son's declaration and denouncement chose grace in the face of this affront. This response did not seem to grow over time. It was not a decision slowly made to forgive and find acceptance. The father chose grace from the very start. The father seems to have divided up his estate with no hint of condemnation, freely offering the appropriate portion to the beloved son who was severing all ties with family. Then the father seems to have waited, hoping against hope that the one he still considered his son might one day return. While the son was still far off, Jesus says, before he had a chance to plead with his father for forgiveness, before he could be asked to be taken on as nothing more than a hired hand, the father was running out to meet him with an embrace, a kiss, and in order to restore him to the position of a beloved son. That is what the robe, the ring, and the sandals here signified. This was much more than the son sought. It was more than he felt he deserved. Indeed, it was much more than he did deserve. It was more than he had any right to request or expect. The father's response turned the expectations of the whole story upside down. This child had departed with a declaration that his father was dead to him. But the father's response defended rather that the son was the one being restored to life and belonging within the household. This moment of grace and life-giving was a moment to cherish. It was a time for celebration. It was a moment of reversal and grace to be prized far above any pain and anger engendered from actions long past. While the father focused on the reconciliation and restoration of his dead and lost son, the older brother had a different focus. He had had a long time to ponder his brother's repudiation of the family. That brother had gone off to ignore his responsibilities while he had stayed behind to shoulder the burden of two. His indignation towards this brother had only grown over time. His focus was on things like the inheritance, his indignation, his loss, his grievances, his being harmed, his feelings. Those were impediments to extending grace, forgiveness, and welcome. After all, if he simply accepted his brother back, how was that not condoning his brother's errors? Did it not invalidate the superiority of his own actions? Did it not further disregard the Mosaic command to honor one's parents? For the older brother, at issue was how he was perceived and valued in the treatment given his younger brother. For the Father, what mattered was reconciliation, redemption, and wholeness. He wanted the family restored, including this wayward child. He did not judge the relative merits of one son against the other. He was not focused on the integrity of the inheritance. Grace placed its full value on enabling each to live in wholeness, rather than be concerned with condemnation and repayment for misdeeds. He dealt with each one by valuing their dignity as persons, each of whom he dearly loved. Such are God's values toward us. God is much more concerned with directing us onto a wholesome path than condemning us for getting it wrong. It's rather much like Martin Luther King Jr.'s comment that hate is far too heavy a burden to bear, while love offers a much easier path forward. Grace does not hold on to an account of past wrongs to be set right. It focuses instead on making people right without such. Despite the younger brother having done very wrong, in spite of the brokenness that he had left in his wake, regardless of the pain and anguish he had inflicted on his father, grace overcame that to treat him with dignity and worth. It established a new standard for him to live into, once again becoming the son he should have been all along. Jesus knew the failures of those in his retinue. He was also concerned to elevate them to full belonging and participation in God's reign. Their dignity as persons was not to be cast aside, despite any failures or errors committed. God's grace looks to the dignity God has placed within us. It calls us to rise up to meet that dignity. When will we learn to treat others properly, according to the standards of God's grace?